We're excited to announce that our very own podcasting platform, Zencastr, has become a new sponsor to the show. Check out the podcast's discount link in our show notes and stay tuned for why we love using Zen for the podcast.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to the Archaeotech Podcast, episode 142. I'm your host, Chris Webster, with my co-host, Paul Zimmerman. Today, we finally talk about space archaeology with Dr. Justin Walsh. Let's get to it. All right, welcome to the show, everybody. Paul, how's it going?
It's going okay. We're recording now 1 week before Thanksgiving, and I'm really looking forward to that break. How are you doing, Chris?
Not too bad. I am in the same boat, man. I look forward to Thanksgiving because all my clients, everybody, pretty much radio silence for a guaranteed at least 2 days.
Oh,
and then combine that with the weekend. Yeah, and it's 4 days. So I love it. This is my favorite holiday. No presents, just good food and nobody to talk to. So that's amazing. All right. Well, along those lines, there's other places where there's nobody to talk to, and that's often space. And that's a terrible segue, but so we're about to bring on a guest. And I got to say, before we start, my very first interview that I conducted on the CRM Archaeology podcast. So my first interview podcasting, where I was at a conference, I wasn't doing it from my home over Skype or anything like that, was with Alice Gorman. And she was a space archaeologist, or is a space archaeologist. And at the time, it was at the SAAs in Waikiki, Hawaii. And she was talking to me about her research project at the time, looking at zip ties. I honestly would have to go back to the episode to remember exactly what she was talking about with zip ties, but it was zip ties related to working on space-related things. So hopefully we can get her on sometime to talk about that. But in the meantime, we've got another person to talk about space archaeology, and that's Justin Walsh. Justin, welcome to the show.
Hi, nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So what is space archaeology, man? Because first off, I think it sends off all the beacons for us archaeologists, us uber geek archaeologists. Like, I want to be the first archaeologist on Mars. That's like literally the first thing I think of when you say space archaeologist.
Yeah, well, that's great because there is archaeology on Mars because all of the various probes and rovers that we've sent there and all of the assorted detritus that has gone with them, it forms the material culture record of human activity on Mars to date. So yeah, that's really what it's all about. Just in a nutshell, space archaeology is the study of material culture associated with human activity in space or on Earth that is directed at space. So it could be anything from the probes and landers and rovers that I mentioned before on, the Moon, Mars, and Venus and other places around the solar system, the interstellar probes like the Voyagers and the Pioneers. And then it's also sites on Earth, like the Cape Canaveral launch sites or places where technology was developed to allow us to operate in space. Or even, we're recording today on the 19th of November. We've just heard about the Arecibo Observatory Radio Telescope, that it is being decommissioned by the National Science Foundation. And it is definitely a major piece of space archaeology.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you brought that up because I literally saw that article just a couple hours ago, talking the first time I saw that. And I knew it was damaged, I think over the summer or something like that, when that cable busted on it. Do you think they would make that a World Heritage Site, or is that up to the local community to make that significant?
Boy, that's a really interesting question about the World Heritage listing. I'm not sure. I don't see why it couldn't be. Mm-hmm. What I know, in fact, just from today, I've been in contact with folks at NSF. I know that they are aware of their due diligence with historic preservation and that they've already been in contact with the Puerto Rico SHPO about starting to evaluate and document the heritage aspects of the site as they go about their decommissioning. So that is actually something they're thinking about, and that is space archaeology.
Nice. That's really cool.
A lot of people think archaeology and they immediately associate it with ancient. And so, space archaeology, most of it wouldn't even qualify under the National Registry of Historic Places because most of it is not even 50 years old. I mean, some of it certainly at this point is. Not exactly to play devil's advocate, but a devil's advocate-ish question here is, how can the study of something so new be considered, quote unquote, archaeology?
Well, I suppose if you think of archaeology as being associated with distant past, you're right. It doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense. But archaeology, to me, and I think to a lot of other practitioners, and hopefully we're getting the story across to the public as well, is really about a perspective towards material culture, towards objects and built spaces as evidence for human behavior. And if you take that view of things, then anything that is currently happening is archaeological in nature. It is worthy of our study and it is available for our study. So there really isn't any temporal boundary to archaeology as far as I see it.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Yeah, because anthropology, anthropologists in general, which, in the United States, if you're an archaeologist, you're an anthropologist because of the way that we structure our fields in university. But, anthropologists in general, though, you can slap anything on the front of anthropologist and be one, like commercial property anthropologist, industrial anthropologist. They study all kinds of stuff, right? So it seems to me like when you're using the material culture of something, that immediately puts it into the archaeology realm, but taking the root word, archaeo or archaic off of there, which, meaning old. Mm-hmm. It's almost like it's just space archaeology is like anthropological archaeology, right? Because you're studying current human behavior, not that much distant past, but with material culture. That's a pretty cool concept. I like that.
Yeah, this is precisely the idea, right? That, even things that happened yesterday are in the past. And there's a material culture record of that. And archaeologists are absolutely equipped and used to dealing with that, to interpret human behavior and understand how societies formed, how cultures exist to structure those societies, et cetera. That's what we do. So that's our approach.
Nice. And Paul mentioned the NRHP, the National Register of Historic Places. And in the United States, we have 4 criteria which we use to determine the significance of a site. And as you said, it doesn't have to be 50 years old necessarily. That's the general first baseline rule is 50 years old. But like the Twin Towers site was NRHP eligible the minute it happened because it was nationally significant, right? It doesn't have to be necessarily old. It was a nationally significant event that could be argued changed the course of events in this country. So given that the NRHP is only applicable to the United States and space is available to all, are there a set of rules that the world, for lack of a better way to say that, I don't know what governing body even controls this, but that have determined what makes something significant? And where I'm going with that is, like, how many satellites do we have to crash into the moon before it's kind of routine and they're not all significant? You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was looking at the unveiling of the 100 mummies that they found at Saqqara in the last, whatever week or month or whatever it was. And I'm thinking the same question. How many of those do we need to learn more about Egyptian burial practices?
Yeah.
So that at a certain point, things do become routine. But I'm glad you brought up the international nature of space, because it is one of the most interesting aspects of thinking about heritage and thinking about the practice of archaeology in the space context. So as you rightly stated, according to the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which is under the United Nations, space is international territory. It's completely international territory, and all of it is international territory. What that means is that, in practical terms, no nation can claim sovereignty or jurisdiction over any part of space. Now, there's some back and forth about this at the moment because of NASA's plans to go back to the moon and their interest in promoting commercial exploitation of resources on the moon, and whether it's possible for commercial organizations to possess parts of the moon that they, in other words, what they've mined, and to sell it. So this is kind of a little bit of a gray area at the moment, but since 1967, it has been crystal clear that space is international. And with regard to heritage, there's absolutely no guidance about the protection of heritage. What we know is that, according to the Outer Space Treaty, any item that a state or other entity puts into space remains their property. They have the right to do with it whatever they want. However, since no government can have jurisdiction or sovereignty over territory, nobody can designate a site as protected. And so I actually wrote an article about this for the journal Space Policy in 2012, because it was such a bizarre and interesting set of circumstances. So even you can say that Tranquility Base, the site of the Apollo 11 landing, which is now 50 years old, but wasn't in 2012, right, that is the most significant cultural site in the history of humanity, because it will always be the first place that humans put a foot on something that wasn't the Earth. Right. So how do we protect that? Because people are going to want to go there. And people talk about monetizing it, about going and taking artifacts and selling them on eBay or whatever, right? They really are talking about this. And that isn't something I think that archaeologists want or probably the general public want happening, but nobody has power to do anything about that. In 2011, NASA published a white paper that set out guidelines for spacefaring entities about approaches to historic sites. And they specifically marked out Apollo 11, the first visit, and Apollo 17, the last crewed visit to the moon, as being special and is needing particular care. And so they set what they called hard boundaries of, I think it was 75 meters from Apollo 11 and 225 meters from Apollo 17. Mm-hmm. Those have no legal force whatsoever. And so what I was proposing in the article that I wrote is that we have a whole series of treaties here on Earth that deal with international territory and deal with heritage in those spaces. And so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can take the approaches that really are useful from the UNESCO Convention on Cultural Property and from the World Heritage Convention and also from the Antarctic Treaty and from the Law of the Sea. And also there's the 2001, I believe, the Treaty on Heritage, Underwater Heritage. Right. And all of these have guidance for what to do in international situations and how to protect that stuff. Not much has happened until, I would say, really in the last year or so, as the prospect of the Artemis missions, those NASA missions to return crews to the moon, have become more real. And as NASA has promoted what they call the Artemis Accords, which do actually have a little mark out for heritage, but they're incredibly vague. There's nothing legal about it in the sense that there's no prescriptions. It just says we'll protect heritage.
Yeah.
So it's a really interesting thing that you end up with a situation. This is fascinating. In 2010, California actually designated the objects at Tranquility Base as part of its historic heritage and put them in its register. The objects,
which is meaningless.
Huh. Yeah, but they put the objects in the register, but they couldn't say anything about the site. And New Mexico later the same year did the same thing. Both states are saying the technology was developed within our boundaries. We consider this to be significant, and therefore we are saying that they are protected. Okay, as I've just gone to great lengths to say, it doesn't really mean anything, except, particularly California, there are many, many companies in the space industry that are headquartered here. Mm-hmm. And so they might want to be careful about what they do there, but no legal force and no protection of the landscape.
Yeah,
those are significant issues that still need to be resolved.
That kind of sets a dangerous precedent too, what California and New Mexico have done, because why not step that back? I've worked plenty in Nevada where you find obsidian in northwestern Nevada. You find obsidian that has sources in California. But obviously, when the obsidian was quarried in California by Native Americans, however many hundreds, if not thousands of years ago, in either dealt with or transported or subsequently brought to Nevada, could you argue? I mean, California and Nevada didn't exist, but these are California products in Nevada. So why doesn't California have Native American obsidian sites on their register of historic places? That's a wacky concept. And I'm surprised they set that precedent by doing that on the moon, which is insane.
I think Wayne Donaldson, who was the SHPO at the time, was working with Beth O'Leary, who was a professor at New Mexico State. She's now retired from there. Mm-hmm. She actually did what's called the Lunar Legacy Project, which was really the very first space archaeology project starting in 1999. And you can still find the website for that on the New Mexico State website, Lunar Legacy Project, if you want to look it up. And she was able to figure out exactly what had been left behind. There were 106 objects. And so the two of them together, he's a space and aviation buff. And so the two of them decided to do this, and they were successful, I think partly to draw attention to the fact that these things aren't protected and can't really be protected.
Yeah.
This is fascinating. What you were just telling us took this entire conversation in a direction I wasn't expecting. All the questions I have are about methods and maybe some theoretical aspects. And you just took it towards legal, which is wonderful because that's actually the practicalities of what you have to deal with. So I'm wondering how much of your work as a space archaeologist is dealt with understanding the legalities. And then a secondary question to that is, who are the people interested in space archaeology or space junk or space heritage, however we're going to term it, that force a legal perspective on how you do your work?
Okay, so the first part of your question, the legal side of things, it was definitely an education. For example, preparing that article and having to deal. I had a space lawyer because there is space law. They have to deal with insurance and liability and all those other kinds of things. And once you have that, you have lawyers. And so I definitely had to consult with a space lawyer about what I was saying and whether it made any sense from a legal perspective. That was really interesting. And actually, just last month, or maybe the end of September, I participated in a planetary science workshop that was about the permanently shadowed regions of the moon where they plan to go, because that's where they think there'll be water. And then there was a breakout session that was about how do you protect heritage sites if you want to do science at them? Like people might want to do material science, like what's happened to the metal in the lunar lander over 50 plus years of being exposed to the lunar environment, those kinds of things. That makes a lot of sense, or microbiology experiments or whatever. So I did participate in that. And, there's a lot. You've got the scientists. And when I say the scientists, I should be clear. I mean the physical scientists. You've got the legal people. You've got the commercial people. And then you sometimes have people like me. There are not that many of us, but somebody has to represent that aspect of it. And I try and do that where it's possible. I know, for example, you talk about Alice, who's, a partner with me on the International Space Station Archaeological Project, which I'm sure we'll talk about. She also does that kind of thing in Australia and elsewhere. So we do try and do that. The latter part of your question, the interest in space archaeology, I think it's really moving at this moment from novelty to reality. That we're starting to really get the word out between the ISS project and other publications. And Alice had a book recently out called Dr. Space Junk versus the Universe, which has really made a splash on the popular science communication front. Those kinds of things. The people are really starting to understand what we're doing. Also, because with the ISS project, we've got lots of publications coming out. And there was the 20th anniversary of ISS just a couple of weeks ago. So that things are changing in that area, and our voice is being heard more, which is really nice.
Awesome. Well, on that positive note, at least, let's go to our first break. And when we come back, we'll talk about that ISS project and a lot more with Justin Walsh. Back in a minute. Chris Webster here for the Archaeology Podcast Network. We strive for high quality interviews and content so you can find information on any topic in archaeology from around the world. One way we do that is by recording interviews with our hosts and guests located in many parts of the world all at once. We do that through the use of Zencastr. That's Zencastr. Zencastr allows us to record high-quality audio with no stress on the guest. Just send them a link to click on, and that's it. Zencastr does the rest. They even do automatic transcriptions. Check out the link in the show notes for 30% off your first 3 months, or go to zencastr.com and use the code Archaeotech. That's ARCHAEOTECH. Looking to expand your knowledge of X-rays and imaging in the archaeology field? Then check out An Introduction to Paleoradiography, a short online course offering professional training for archaeologists and affiliated disciplines. Created by archaeologist, radiographer, and lecturer James Elliott, the content of this course is based upon his research and teaching experience in higher education. It is approved by the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists as 4 hours of training. That's in the UK, for those of you that don't know. So don't miss out on this exciting opportunity for professional and personal development. For more information on pricing and course structure, visit paleoimaging.com. That's PALEO imaging.com, and look for the link in the show notes to this episode. Welcome back to episode 142 of the Archaeotech podcast, and we are speaking with space archaeologist Justin Walsh, which is about the coolest title you could have besides actual archaeology astronaut or astronaut archaeologist. I think that's like the next best one, right, Justin?
Yeah, unfortunately, at the moment, it's actually not possible to be an archaeologist astronaut. So, but we can talk about that.
Yeah, I have a question queued up about that.
Exactly. Well, before we get to that, you mentioned the ISS project at the end of the last segment, and that is one of the things we mentioned in your bio. So let's just start off right there. What is the International Space Station Archaeology Project?
So the International Space Station Archaeological Project is the first comprehensive archaeological investigation of a human habitat in space. Mm-hmm. Basically, what we are doing is we are trying to understand how humans adapt to a new environment, which is absolutely, anthropological archaeology. In this case, an environment that is marked by isolation and enclosure, and especially, obviously, microgravity. How do humans exist in that space? But also on top of that, that this is a supposedly, and I'm not saying it's not, but it's purposely labeled as an international project. It's a collaborative project of 5 space agencies, 15 countries. There have been people from 19 different nations, 241, as of Monday, 242 people have visited the space station in 20 years. And so in that sense, we want to understand, how international is it? To what extent can we identify national or international boundaries? How are there gendered spaces on the space station? Those kinds of things. So those are aspects of our project as well.
Yeah, what's just really quick, as we're recording this, what's really interesting about that, just mentioning the international aspect and gendered aspect. I mean, I just watched the SpaceX launch of 4 astronauts to the International Space Station on Sunday. And then I think they docked something like late Monday night to the ISS, which I didn't catch the docking, but that means they're fully on board now. And there were 4 people, including 1 woman and 1 astronaut from Japan. So right there, you're introducing new people, which leads me to my question about that. It must be incredibly difficult to study something like this, because it's not like the space station is visited only every 5 years or something, and we drop a new set of astronauts there and pick off the old ones. I mean, they're there for 6 months in this particular trip. And I think the ISS has been continuously inhabited for most of this time, if not all of it. And given that that's the case, and they get regular supply missions, even when we weren't flying them up there and the Russians were, they get regular supply missions. And I mean, it must be a constantly changing environment from that standpoint. So how do you study something that you physically can't go to see yourself and is constantly changing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So by the way, we should also note that Victor Glover is the first Black astronaut to be a long duration visitor or inhabitant of the space station. So it is a diverse crew, and that's certainly an interesting aspect of it. Also, things are written in Russian and things are written in English, and there are lots of crew come from countries where neither of those are the first language. Right. So how do we study a site like this? And in fact, the fact that we can't go there is, I have to admit, it's actually kind of the reason for the project in the first place. So the inspiration for this was in 2015. I've been thinking about space archaeology for about 12 years now, but I was following NASA on Twitter, and I saw that they were advertising for new astronaut candidates. And I looked at the requirements, and they specifically state that if you have a STEM degree at any level, BA, MA, PhD, if you have a STEM degree, then you qualify to apply. But if you have a degree in some other field, and then they list other fields, and then one of the fields is social sciences, and in parentheses, it actually said geography, anthropology, archaeology, close parenthesis. And I thought, you got to be kidding me, right? Not only are they saying that social scientists can't be astronauts, but they specifically call out archaeologists. Like they were even, the idea that they were thinking about us enough to say we don't want that. That was surprising to me, that we were on a certain level. It was surprising that we were on the radar enough for that, but then that they were also really sure they didn't want to hear from us. So I thought, that's kind of dumb. I know that they want to do long duration missions to the moon, 3-year long missions to Mars, maybe longer missions even to deep space. They're thinking and planning this. That's the whole reason, in fact, that ISS exists, is to plan and prepare for those kinds of missions. Shouldn't they want to know?
Right.
About the society that the crew, a micro society, definitely, but a society nonetheless, how they live and how they interact, and, how they structure their lives and what kind of culture they're creating on their own up there. Shouldn't they want to know about that if they want to succeed in those missions and if they want to promote the well-being of their crew? So I was thinking about that in end of 2015. And I don't know, do you know Jason DeLeon's Undocumented Migration Project?
Yeah, down on the wall.
So his book Land of Open Graves had just been published right around that same time, and I was reading it and being blown away by what an amazing project that was, and how creative he was in finding archaeological solutions to answer the kinds of questions he had about the experiences of migrants crossing the Sonoran Desert. And one of the methods he did was he gave them disposable cameras before they would cross the Mexican-U.S. border and let them take pictures. And I thought, this is what they've been doing all along on ISS. They've been taking pictures. And fortunately for us, the habitation of ISS, which has indeed been completely continuous since November 2nd, 2000, there have been at least 2 people on the space station. For that entire time, they've been taking thousands and thousands of photographs because the rise of digital photography coincided with that. So instead of like previous missions where it was all film and you're limited by how many canisters of film they brought with them, this time they can take as many pictures as they want. They upload them to NASA, and NASA has them, and they use them for whatever they're going to use them for. And they've been keeping them. And so my idea was, hey, if we could, first of all, those images have metadata, which means that we can put them in order by their time and date of when they were taken. And so that's like metaphorical stratigraphy, right? We can put them in order, and we can understand change over time. And so if we can just capture the data that's in those photographs of who is in the photo and where they're located in the space station and what objects are in that picture and the time and date of the picture, suddenly we could understand behavioral patterns over the arc of the space station's occupation. And that was a way that by proxy, we could examine what was going on. So that was really the start of it. But then there's a number of other aspects to the project that we're also doing. But that was kind of the start, was with the photos.
Mm-hmm.
I want to rewind just a little bit here. We were cracking up while you were talking about anthropologists, geographers, archaeologists need not apply. That's a little shocking because you know that anything that involves people going into space, there are psychologists and psychiatrists and sociologists and medical doctors that deal with the effects of cognition and emotion and whatever that they were consulted and were probably part of the project. So
since 1961, that they've been doing decades of this kind of physiological and psychological research. So because they want to improve mission success.
Of course. So for you, how easily and how frequently do you see the social scientists, such as yourself, interacting with the physical scientists or the administrative muckety-mucks that are actually deciding policy for the ISS?
So obviously, we thought long and hard about that first approach to NASA because we knew that there was a strong likelihood, given their obvious attitude towards our field, their stated attitude, in fact, given that we knew that we had to approach them in a way where we could already start to build some confidence in what we were suggesting we could do. So our first idea was to contact people in the NASA History Office, because those are historians who are tasked with creating the historical record and archiving the documents for the agency. There's also a federal preservation officer, as in every agency, and actually that person now, and has been for the last, I would say, 4 or 5 years, been an RPA. So that's really good. I mean, those were people that we could reach out to who would kind of not immediately dismiss us, and that we knew that we could get an open ear from, and who would be able to give us advice about how to operate in their environment. And then we were able to make some connections through them to the ISS Outreach Office, and then through them to the ISS Research Office. And we had to write an unsolicited proposal, which we did in 2017. And they said, okay, what you're asking for is stuff we can give you, but until you have funding, we're not spending any time on you. And that's fair, because that's essentially what they say to every researcher. You know, if you're a biologist or whatever, you write a proposal and you say, this is what I want to study. And they say, well, we either can do that or we can't do that. And then they say, where's your money? And so we got our foot in the door like that. But what really turned everything around with the research office was I was playing around with some of the photos that were on the NASA Flickr site. There's about 7,000 images that are up there covering all the expeditions, actually now up to 8,000. And I was looking at individual images and thinking, I'm trying to plan for the project and like, how are we going to capture this data? Like, how am I going to get this information into a database? So I built a rudimentary database in Access, and I was like, okay, who are all the people that I see in here? Where are they located in the image? Where are they located in the modules? What are the items that are associated with them? And what are the other items in the image that are not associated with them, but they're just there? So that late in another picture, I could say, well, that thing moved. It's not there anymore, right? So I was looking at this picture of a Russian module, which is one of the main habitation modules. It's called Zvezda. And I noticed that on one wall, there were all these objects that were kind of surprising. So they included a gold Orthodox cross and actual painted icons and toys and photographic portraits of Soviet space heroes like Yuri Gagarin and just all kinds of objects there on that wall. And I was just sitting there thinking about it and like, is that stuff always there? So I started looking at other pictures of the same space. I was like, wait, some of that stuff is there and some of that stuff's not there. Okay. So now what I did is I went through all of the photographs of that module and I chose 48 of them that showed a change from one to the next. And then in the database, I cataloged everything I saw on that wall and where it was. And in total, it was something like 414 instances of display. And I was able to do a statistical analysis of what they were, what kind of thing they were, where they were located, et cetera, over a 14-year period. Wow. And I was able to show that the items didn't just, it wasn't like a linear, like start at 0 and go to 75 objects. Nope. It was actually a sine wave. It went up and then it went down and then went up and went down. And the religious displays were actually a separate phenomenon because in the early period when there were a lot of items, there were few religious items. And then in the later period where there were a lot of items, there were many religious items. So I was able to identify patterns that nobody had ever paid any attention to or thought about what they might mean. And I sent this to our liaison at Johnson Space Center. And he wrote back and he said, I've been looking at that wall for 20 years and I knew that stuff was up there, or I knew that there was stuff up there, but I never knew what it was. And I certainly didn't know that it ever changed. And like the light bulb went on for him with that. And so a few weeks later, maybe a month later, I was paying attention to the launch of a SpaceX Dragon supply capsule to the space station. I started thinking about the stuff that goes up, and Dragon, there are like 4 or 5 different supply craft that bring things to the space station. But the only one that brings anything back is Dragon, because it's the only one that re-enters the atmosphere and survives. The others all burn up. So what they do is they put all their trash on the other ones. They're called Cygnus, and there's Progress and ATV and HTV. Those are all those, they burn up in the atmosphere. They're just used to incinerate their trash. But there are some items that have to come back to Earth. And since the end of the shuttle program in 2011, they use Dragon. And I thought to myself, that's like, we can analogize this to the archaeological interpretation of discard practices, right? So if you think about, you find potsherds on the ground outside of a settlement or outside of a dwelling, right? It's just garbage and nobody cares about it. It's cheap. And like that tells us something about what those people thought about pottery when it was broken. As opposed to like the prestigious tomb that has tons of grave goods in it, foreign sourced objects and whatever that you put in there with grandma. It tells us what you thought about grandma, right? So we can create an analysis. The stuff that's coming back on Dragon is really important. Okay. And the stuff that isn't considered important. And some stuff is actually just stored on the space station. It's full of stuff. Yeah. But the point is that I was interested in examining those practices of handling the cargo coming back from the space station as a discard practice and what that could tell us about life on the space station. So I wrote to this guy, as I said, a month after I'd sent him the analysis of the objects on that wall. And he was like, oh, sure, let me write to the person who's in charge of that contract and see if we can't set you up with something. I was like, what? Oh, we can do that? Awesome. And then, sure enough, 3 months later, I was in Houston observing stuff coming back from the space station.
Nice.
So, and so these are both the icon stuff and the cargo stuff we're writing articles about. In fact, our very first actually published article just came out on Tuesday, and it's about the icon stuff in the journal Religions. And we've got another one that's currently under review. Fingers crossed that one will get accepted on the icon stuff. And then the cargo stuff we're still working on. But this is all research that we're in the process of actually finally getting out there.
Wow. That is, all I can say is, wow, that's amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah. And we're going to take this into a third segment with you. And a lot of times Paul and I would just kind of digest everything in the third segment, but I think we have so many more questions. If you got time, we're just going to continue this on into segment 3. And I think we're going to do that break right now because I've got more questions. I know Paul's got more questions, and there's no sense in getting into it right now. So we'll just extend segment 3 a little bit. And we'll be back with one more segment and some mind-blowing space archaeology with Justin Walsh in just a couple minutes.
Let's do it.
You may have heard my pitch for membership. It's a great idea and really helps out. However, you can also support us by picking up a fun t-shirt, sticker, or something from a large selection of items from our TeePublic store. Head over to arcpodnet.com/shop for a link. That's arcpodnet.com/shop to pick up some fun swag and support the show. All right, welcome back to the final segment of the Archaeotech Podcast, episode 142. We are speaking with Justin Walsh, and a lot of times Paul and I will just come back and start wrapping up the interview in segment 3 or have it after the day. But man, this is just so many questions and so interesting here. And Justin, one of the things I wanted to talk about, because we were talking about, getting these projects done and talking to NASA, and, you mentioned NASA, looking at NASA's resources and NASA's photos and, Johnson Space Center. But this is the International Space Station. How much of the history of this space station is divided amongst the member nations that are actually helping, fund this project and bring this thing together? And along those lines, can you go to them for help?
It's a great question. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right that the International Space Station is international, and there are 5 space agencies. So NASA, the European Space Agency, Roscosmos, which is the Russian space agency, JAXA, which is the Japanese, and the Canadian Space Agency. Those are the 5 participant partners, international partners, as they call them. And the reason why for the photos we're so focused on NASA is because they actually hold the photo archives for 4 of the 5 agencies. And so the Russians have their own archives, and that actually plays into the larger geography of the space station, which is there's a Russian orbital segment, which is purely Russian and which is totally managed and paid for by them. And then there's what's called the U.S. orbital segment, which consists of the American, Japanese, and European modules. And so, and I've actually heard that it's called the pressurized mating adapter that forms the boundary between U.S. Node 1 and the Russian module Zarya is referred to jokingly by the crew as Checkpoint Charlie, in reference to the Berlin Wall.
Yeah.
Right. The fact is that these crews train together intensively. Everybody is required to speak Russian and English, although that's done to a greater or lesser extent. In fact, they refer to what they speak as Runglish on board. And so they also often will eat meals together. In particular, they have a tradition of eating Friday evening meals together, usually in the Russian segment, although sometimes it's in one of the American modules. By the way, those traditions are the kinds of anthropological points of interest that we love to focus on, right? The fact that they have a tradition that involves a certain etiquette and a certain time and place, and, they share food and all that stuff. But they do sleep in separate parts of the space station. They generally work in different parts of the space station. And I think for the most part, the US and Russian orbital segment crews don't see each other very much on a day-to-day basis. And so that's something we really want to examine. And your point about how other agencies can help. We would love to get our hands on the photo archives of the Roscosmos folks, because we don't want our study to be biased towards the U.S. orbital segment. We want to understand the space station. And so, up until about 2008, there were only 2 crew berths on the space station, and usually 3 crew. So that one other person had to find a place to put a sleeping bag, usually. Not the greatest situation.
No.
Yeah.
And then the U.S. sent up 2 berths. And then in 2009, they sent up another 2 berths. So they have 4. And at that point, the NASA archives stop showing as much what's going on the Russian side of things. So we really want to see, like from 2009 especially to the present, what is life like for the Russian crew? It is extremely challenging to get access to those archives for bureaucratic reasons, linguistic reasons, et cetera. But we are working on them, and I'm hopeful that we will be able to add those materials to the set that we're looking at. Likewise, we want to talk to the crew from various nations. We want to ask them questions about what their experiences are that go beyond the kinds of questions that they're really used to answering. because that's the other thing. They're all really good at staying right on point, maybe better than me in interviews. They're really good at just kind of giving a very rote response. And so we want to, ask them questions that elicit more interesting and more useful information. There's all of these kinds of things that we want to do. Yeah. So we're thinking about it internationally, of course.
Nice.
This is fascinating. I mean, I really did like it. And I wrote down words that you said in the previous segment. You said human habitat in space, and it immediately made me think of Four Fields anthropology, and that this is a very American archaeology approach. Archaeology, typically in the U.S., being one of the subfields of anthropology. And now you're talking about ethnography, ethnology. You're really bridging a bunch of different fields that don't normally get bridged. I mean, we all kind of have the general sense of belonging to the same overall field, all sitting under the same umbrella. It's fascinating because you keep on telling me about different kinds of techniques that you're using, different methods. I wasn't thinking about materials coming back down to earth earlier when I wrote a question that I've got on here, asking what the techniques that you use in your work. Certainly, you're not walking transects, but you are looking at materials through photographs. You're planning how you're interviewing the people that are participating in it. You are looking at materials that come back. You are what else are you doing? I'm sure that you're going to tell me 2 or 3 things that I hadn't even considered yet.
Or what you would like to do too. What would you like to do?
Let's not even go there. How many more hours do we have?
Go to the ISS.
We can make a whole podcast out of the entire project. So go back to your first thing about the Four Field stuff. Look, I mean, my training is actually as a classical archaeologist, right? So like we're barely archaeologists to begin with. Or barely anthropological. Let's say barely anthropological. Like so the question of the Four Fields almost doesn't even register for me. I mean, the thing that's not where my training was. My PhD is in art history, believe it or not, with a concentration in classical archaeology. And so in that sense, I feel like those boundaries they don't feel as firm maybe to me as they might for other archaeologists. It also helps that, my co-PI on this is Alice Gorman, who's an Australian archaeologist who started out doing lithics research and stuff like that. So we come from these wildly disparate backgrounds. We arrived at this interesting topic and we're just like, what can we do to learn more about this that's informed at least by our perspective of focusing on material culture? So you're asking like, what else are we going to do? And we're not walking transects. That's absolutely, actually, I will say one thing we were originally thinking like, what happened to the trash space shuttle? When they had the space shuttle up until 2011, they would bring much more stuff back than they can now on Dragon. And we're like, some of that stuff must have gotten thrown away. Did it end up in like a landfill at Kennedy Space Center? And it took me a while, but I finally found out this summer that whatever was literally trash or waste, like biohazard waste, was taken to the city dump in Cocoa Beach, Florida. And so it's there, but you'd never be able to find it.
Yeah.
So there is ISS trash in a landfill. We were initially thinking, hey, we could do a dig. It'd be like digging a midden or something, but no. So we can't do that. But we are interested in pushing the boundaries of doing archaeology by proxy, since we are absolutely not allowed to go there. And so one of the things we're working on right now is we have a proposal into the organization that manages what's called the ISS National Laboratory, the Center for Advancement of Science and Space. They're a nonprofit chartered by Congress to manage research on ISS. And we've said we want to get crew on the space station to do an archaeological survey for us. So in a sense, they might be the first archaeologists in space, even though they're not professionals. Our idea is basically, again, like, why STEM and not us? So they do, there are Jacks and Jills of all trades. They will do a physics experiment, a chemistry experiment, a medical experiment, all in the space of a day. And all they're doing is they're following procedures that have been written for them. They're expected to be flexible, and they're expected to be able to carry out with attention to detail the experiments that they're asked to do. And that's really it. So why can't they do an archaeological experiment? There's no reason. So, I mean, not just that, but like archaeologists are always working with volunteers and students and things like that in our excavations. And, we oversee them and we tell them what to do and we come up with good results. So why not? So what we're going to ask them to do are a number of different tasks that are going to illuminate aspects of sociocultural behavior on the space station. Like we want to do surface swabbing of various modules in order to see what kind of detritus is building up on the walls. And we think of this is like soil. It's made up of presumably hair, oil, dirt, sweat, vomit, fat skin cells, fabric, food, everything you can think of, right? Whatever's in the air and hits the wall and sticks, we'll sample it and look at it. Well, it turns out that there's been a swabbing experiment since the early 2000s by people who were looking at the microbiology of the space station, the microbiome, and they're trying to understand what are the bacteria and the fungi. And I was actually just talking to the guy last week who's in charge of that, and he said, yeah, we can give you the swabs when we're done. And we can add that to, we actually wanted to have our own swabs done. We're also going to do aerosol sampling. We're working with a geologist at Duke, a guy named Dan Richter, who focuses on the geology of the Anthropocene and especially on human-generated soils. And talking this out, really, not through, but talking it out with Dan, we're kind of coming to the conclusion that in a microgravity environment where nothing falls to the ground, there's no ground either, that the air itself becomes like a soil matrix. And that if we can capture using aerosol samplers, which are actually equipment that NASA has, we can capture the stuff that is in the air. We can get a window, as we do it in sampling soil matrices in the ground on Earth. We can get a window into the sociocultural life of the space station. We want to understand where crew are spending their time. They have these calendars for the day, these agendas, where it's like 15 minutes on this and 10 minutes on that and whatever. But like those things are constantly in flux. How much time are they actually spending in different places? So what I'm thinking we can do is we can put like RFID tags on the astronauts and antennas and readers at the thresholds of all the modules, and they'll get triggered every time they pass from one module to another on a typical day, and we can start to register who's spending time where, for how long, right? NASA has none of the space stations have ever been able to answer that question, even though I'm sure they'd be very interested in the results, just as they'd be interested in the question of where are women hanging out more or working more in the space station than their numbers would suggest that they would, or Russians or Japanese crew or whatever. What are the patterns of usage of the site? This is a totally archaeological question that we can provide answers to that nobody else can. Right. We want to take a photo of the same spot, the same 1 meter by 1 meter spot on the wall of the space station every day for a month, and just see how objects appear and disappear and track that. So, we've got all kinds of ideas like this. How are different spaces given new meaning by being turned into storage or used for some other activity? How are objects being adapted for new uses? Because they can't go to the store and buy a new tool. These kinds of things, right? So those are all aspects of what we're going to ask them to do. Hopefully we'll get funding. Hopefully we'll get approval. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, I'm blown away here. I'm thinking of my specialty is in Near Eastern archaeology, and the stereotypical Near Eastern structure is built out of mud brick, which is this incredibly pliable material. You can add additions by blowing through walls. You can tear things down. Things change their meaning and their usage over time because the buildings might have, a 200-year lifespan. And I'm hearing the same sort of thing, actually, what you're telling me about within the space station. I wasn't expecting that at all. I was expecting it to be an extremely controlled, regimented space where people have to be at certain places doing certain things at certain times. And what I'm hearing from you is that, that's kind of maybe the platonic ideal of how it's supposed to work. But
just like in all of life, like in all of life, right? You have a plan and then life happens.
Exactly.
So what's the reality? That's what, and this is exactly like, we absolutely were influenced by, William Rathje and the Tucson Garbage Project, showing that what people say about their lives is not what their lives actually are. Right. So you can ask them questions in a questionnaire and get a set of responses, but how does that actually relate to what they're doing as reflected in the material record?
No, absolutely. I want to Since we're getting late in this third segment, I just want to bring around another question. You don't just work with space archaeology. You also are an active archaeologist on various terrestrial sites. So how does the space archaeology inform your terrestrial archaeology when you're looking at something that's not, 20 years old, but you're looking at something, well, actually, I didn't look to see how old the site is that you're working at in Spain. But,
more than 20.
More than 20. If you're looking at an ancient site on Earth, how does your space archaeology inform that?
Wow, that's a great question. I don't know if I've ever thought about it that way. So the site that I'm currently directing a project at since 2014 is called Castelló in the south of Spain. Mm-hmm. It was an Iberian indigenous, that is, site, and then it was a place of conflict between the Carthaginians and the Romans, and then eventually a Roman site, and then in the Visigothic period it gets wiped out. So it's basically like 800 BCE to 800 CE. I guess my approach to thinking about what assemblages of material can tell us, thinking about how to visualize a site changing over time, maybe that's influenced by that. But in a sense, I also find that the work that I'm doing at Castelló and the ways in which we're incorporating new techniques there makes me think about what I can do on the space station, right? Mm-hmm. Because a lot of what the space station stuff is at arm's length. I mean, it is all at arm's length in a sense. It's all by proxy. I can't go there, right? So like, how can I take ideas like photogrammetry, right? So we use photogrammetry a lot at Castelló. We even record every single stratigraphic layer so that we can actually replay the excavation in 3D later on if we want to. Well, that's actually something that we're going to apply to the space station by they have these experimental racks that are built into the wall. And you wouldn't believe this, but there are 332,000 items that have been sent to the space station. NASA has a database, which we've actually been given archived copies of over about a 15-year period. 332,000 items have been sent there. Over 8,000 of them, almost 3%, are considered lost.
Jeez.
So what does that mean in an enclosed space where nothing can fall on the ground? And so, yes. There are socks that have been lost. In fact, I think the thing that was lost for the longest period of time, it was about 5 years, was a sock. I think I'm not joking about that. So, that's incredible. But the thing is, of course, when you let something go in space, it doesn't fall, but because the air is moving, it can move. Mm-hmm. And it will move. And so astronauts frequently have difficulty finding where they put something. They have Velcro all over the place. And actually, Alice is doing this incredible work on the use of Velcro as what she refers to as a gravity surrogate. It's brilliant stuff. Mm-hmm. Using Ziploc bags and Velcro stickers to keep things in place, to act like gravity does. Nice. And so, like, it gets behind stuff, or it gets stuck to ventilation ducts, the intakes. And so we want to remove these experimental racks and see what's behind them and document them. So we're going to do a photogrammetry reconstruction, 3D reconstruction of the surface, and then the removal of the rack and see what's behind it, right? So we can, and like, what's behind the stuff? What gets stuck behind there? What kinds of things get lost? Those are some of the things. I realized that I really got away from your question, which was how does ISS affect Castelló? But in a sense, it's much more the other way around.
Right. You actually didn't get away from my question. That was the second half of my question. I just didn't ask it out loud.
I can read your mind. That's a special skill of space archaeologists.
You can blow my mind. Right. Holy cow. This has been a great interview. Thank you so much, Justin.
Yeah, this has been really fantastic. And I think that if anyone at NASA is listening, and I know at least one NASA engineer listens to the CRM Archaeology podcast because he sent us a question and we talked about it last week. But if any NASA engineers are listening to this, or anyone that works for the space agency, I mean, you got to understand the ability for archaeologists and our special skills and the special skills of anthropology to be able to do these things. Because I think, Justin, like you were saying, even just trying to analyze, even if it's just through material culture and maybe the photographs and things like that, even if you didn't get the RFID tag project going so you could tell where they're at, just knowing where people want to spend time when they're working, when they're, more importantly, at leisure, because leisure time in space is one of the most complicated things to solve as far as long-term space travel goes. Because what do you do for 6 months when you have no tasks, right? I mean, aside from staying alive and keeping the spacecraft going in the same direction and the engines running, what do you do? And that leisure time and understanding how astronauts choose to spend that time in a small space and where they like to go time and time again is probably incredibly important for, the future of space travel. So, and that's just one thing off the top of my head that I was thinking. I'm sure there's 1,000 other things that could be learned from that kind of study.
Definitely. This is kind of, if I can just say, this is kind of the point that I see our research as being, in a sense, kind of practical in a way that archaeology isn't always obviously practical for future developments. But the insights that we have are things that they will never have been able to look at, or even the questions to ask. And so, as we would like to say that what we're doing will have an impact on the future design of space stations and spacecraft that will improve people's lives in space.
Yeah, you're totally right. Yeah, because we often say archaeology is, learn from the past, learn from history, don't repeat your mistakes kind of thing. But to be honest, we are in essence documenting the past, and whether people learn from that or not is really kind of up to them. But the potential ramifications of your research is exactly what you said, improving people's lives in space, and that has real consequences for the whole planet. So.
Yeah, I mean, just on the most basic level, that study I told you about, the display on the wall of Zvezda, right? Mm-hmm. That's not a space that was designated for that by the spacecraft designers. But this is actually something we were able to trace back to previous Soviet space stations going back to the 1980s, that people would put things up on the wall in that exact spot. And it's like, okay, designers, pay attention. People want to be able to do this, like people want to put stuff on the refrigerator door. Give them a space to do this, right? Make them happy. That will make people's lives better. It's simple.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Once you see it.
I'm thinking of the right stuff when they got a chance to look at the first capsule and they're like, where's the window? And they're like, there's no window.
Yeah, exactly.
You need a window for it.
Exactly. That actually was a major issue with Skylab as well, as it turned out. Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, right. Which is why I fell back to it, right?
Exactly. Well, thanks a lot, Justin. This has been fascinating. You sort of offhand mentioned a Space Archaeology podcast, but I want to continue that discussion because I think it would be fantastic. I think our listeners would enjoy it. You and Alice could host it. I mean, come on. Let's talk about that.
We actually both have backgrounds in college radio as it happens. So
fantastic. Yeah. Nice. Well, again, thanks for that. If anybody has any questions for Justin, we'll have some information in the show notes. You can always send Paul and I a tweet or email through the contact info at arcpodnet.com/archaeotech. And again, Justin, thank you so much for this interview. Paul, thanks for the good questions. And that's it. Back again next time. We have to have you on again when there's more developments in this project.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to the Archaeotech podcast. Links to items mentioned on the show are in the show notes at www.arcpodnet.com/archaeotech. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com and paul@lugal.com. Support the show by becoming a member at arcpodnet.com/members. The music is a song called Off-Road and is license free from Apple. Thanks for listening.
This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV Traveling America, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Chris Webster.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.arcpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to arcpodnet.com/members for more info.